Without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Jin to share her views on China in the perspective of essentially the importance of China in the world, what the transformation actually means, and how do we see these transformations and the implications of the rest of the world, what's going on in China. Dr. Jin, over to you.
Thank you so much, Chandra, and thank you so much for inviting me. I'm very flattered and happy to be attending this conference and giving the keynote. I want to start by making the observation that the three fastest growing economies in the world this year, next year, and pretty much in the foreseeable future are all in Asia. And that includes India, China, and Indonesia. Something like 50% of the middle income, or more than 50% of the global millennials, will be in Asia. Asia accounts for 2/3 of global growth. So it is a very important economic region, as well as many other in many other areas. And what we're seeing in terms of the geopolitical tectonic plate shifts will also be manifested in greater cooperation and regionalization of Asia, as well as in many other regions. And so China has a very important role to play in the region. Of course, our remarks today my remarks at least, will focus on the economic side. But I think the dynamics is totally inseparable between the domestic economy and what happens outside in the world, and in particular, China's relation with Asia. Let me start by giving you some observations about the Chinese economy before moving to the new era, and then lastly to finish with some observations about geopolitics and geoeconomics and how that has changed some of the many aspects of globalization and China's role in it. Of course, the Chinese economy has been a very important focal point recently, and there has been many quite pessimistic views about it, especially in Western media, hailing it as peak China, although I'm not really quite sure what that means, because China is still growing. And just to put into context, there have been about 6 collapse stories about the Chinese economy since the 1980s. And that, of course, was during China's most rapid rise in the economic sphere. So we do have to question some of the assumptions that underlie these speculations or hypotheses. Now, I want to be realistic for a moment and talk about why China's growth economy has slowed down, and why there has been viscerally a feeling that something is different. Well, first, in terms of the cyclical factors, there has been the most extended lockdowns during the pandemic. And whilst the US and many others, the US in particular, has spent $5 trillion of stimulus to support the pandemic, of course, Chinese households had very little support to weather that huge shock. The second element is, of course, a real estate transition, which usually takes 10 years to accomplish, but now it's been accelerated to be in 3 years or a little bit longer. And of course, the negative investment growth in real estate and all of the surrounding sectors and construction, which in broad terms accounted for 30% of GDP, has significantly slowed down, if not contracted. So that is, of course, a huge structural and demand shock on the Chinese economy that also affects the confidence. Now, there's a third element, which I think is very much shared among people on the ground, which is really a credit crunch. We used to criticize the old days, especially post 2009, when the West has, and to be fair, also China itself, has attributed to a lot of the growth to be a credit boom and unsustained cycle. Well, it did stave off of a deep recession that would have been precipitated by the global financial crisis, and it had led to misallocation and inefficiency issues, which is a huge problem. But there was no credit crunch, there was no freeze no paralysis of the economy. But because the government wants to avoid a credit boom, the government wants to weed off essentially the Chinese economy off of credit, it's been a bit painful for the Chinese companies in recent days, and in particular the private enterprises. The state enterprises are still well capitalized, and of course the state banks have more incentives to lend to these companies which they perceive to be less risky, or at least they will not be responsible if something goes wrong. They are unequivocally reluctant to lend to private companies, especially in bad times. Now, if we think about this, it doesn't really make much sense, because in good times, the companies don't need much finance. It's really in bad times, which is really critical. So the point here is the financial system is still so bank dominated that it kind of worsens a crisis or a recession when it comes. And so I think the credit squeeze or the financing has also contributed to a slowdown in growth in private investment as well. So a combination of these factors can explain the slowdown. But what's important to ask is whether these are really cyclical reasons or structural permanent decline of the Chinese economy, the latter of which I don't really see. Let's keep in mind that an economy like the US has had 12 recessions in the last 100 years since it's been a mature market economy, and this is rather in one way or another China's first official economic downturn. But the government has also been very careful in not unleashing the kind of policies that we saw after 2009. Whether people agree with this reaction or not is some subject to debate. I believe that rather than structural issues in the Chinese economy, there is a great deficit in aggregate demand. And to deal with aggregate demand deficit issues, you need the kind of proper expansionary policies, which in some sense has not been seen. Part of the reason is also the financial system. Coming back to the financial system, it's not actually that there's explicit discrimination against the private sector. In fact, if we read Premier Li Qiang's speeches and President Xi's encouragement, the focus on directing credit to private, small, medium-sized enterprises is very much encouraged. But financial institutional issues is such that there are many layers in the financial system, so that once you get to the bottom of the real economy, the private sector's cost of capital is extremely high. And that's an institutional constraint that China has not been able to overcome. Part of the reason is, if we look at a country like the US, something like 80% of aggregate credit is coming from direct capital markets, bonds, equity financing, etc., whereas something like 80% of aggregate credit comes from the banking system alone. And that tends to be a developing country phenomenon. So can China graduate from that financial inchoate system to something that is more mature, I think is very essential for China's goal in the coming decade. So I think there are many cyclical reasons explaining the slowdown, but China's also in transition. And I think we need to cut it some slack, because things take time. Now, what are the aspects of transition? We mentioned about the real estate transition, really weeding the Chinese economy off of real estate as a main source of growth is going to take a lot of investment in other sectors like innovation to raise productivity, and of course that all takes time. The other transition is explicitly spelled out by the Chinese leaders, which is to encourage high productivity growth and climb up the value chain, and to really undertake sectors that are very technology oriented. So really, it's a transition from industrialization-based growth to an innovation playbook. Now, innovation playbook requires a gradual change of system, of course. Corporate governance, the financial system is absolutely critical. massive amounts of investment is needed, and it takes time before the fruits of that can be seen. We see that all around the world, even with the AI revolution that we're currently witnessing. There has been investment many years ago, a long time before. And the other problem is that, yes, of course, pursuing innovation and high productivity is absolutely essential, and it's the right thing to do. Really, the only chance that an economy can move from a middle income to high income economy is to be able to have this innovative capacity. If you just look at Japan, Korea, Israel, the handful of countries that made it to rich income, innovation is absolutely critical. But in the short term, and this comes back to the transitional issue, high-tech industries, renewables, even if you count all the broad emerging strategic sectors, it's not enough to displace real estate in the short term as a main contributor to GDP growth and to employment. And so there could be some investment that could offset the negative investment growth in real estate, but the numbers are simply just too big in terms of the real estate. So in that sense, we're seeing a lot of the if you look at a J curve, the downturn before we can see really the realization of a lot of these high-tech innovation and technologies. Now, of course, the other transition, this is not unique to China alone, is the rebalance between economic objectives, economic efficiency, and security concerns. The security concerns are, of course, regards national security, but also more broadly supply chains, climate, global supply, pandemics, global pandemics, and other, food security. And geopolitical matters, of course, is very important. But we're seeing many major economies also trying to balance some of these considerations. So what is economically efficient may no longer be optimal socially or from a national security objective. And the question is whether the pro-growth agenda, which is so critical for a country like China, but for also many other developing countries, can be preserved. Along with that, geopolitical concern is also a raging desire to overcome capitalism's deepest fallacies in China. Now, that's an experiment and with no answers yet, but we have seen that the focus is no longer just placed on GDP growth alone. Of course, it has put into the mix of bag environmental considerations, something that China calls common prosperity, to reduce the massive inequality and unfairness and unequal opportunities that have befallen an economy that has been growing so fast. Now, of course, that is totally understandable and something that many countries are actively thinking about, including what to do with big tech, antitrust issues, deeply debated in Europe and in the US. To overcome these problems, of course, most countries have not been able to do so, maybe with the exception of Denmark, is something that China has been actively thinking about. I think that's also an important element of the transition. I don't think that the country has really figured out exactly how to curb some of these inequity issues without sacrificing too much growth. It really is an experiment that many countries are pursuing, but perhaps China is also leading in many ways because actions are very quickly implemented. But we've seen how the fight against corruption, of course, has been very successful and socially very well received. The kind of the addressing the big tech monopoly issues have been seen, but it's not clear whether the kind of explosive growth that China had experienced in the previous decade is actually possible in a new era where economic considerations, national security, social equity issues are all very important, not just economic priorities. And I think that is part of the new playbook that I also write about in the end of my book, that kind of constant tension between these very important issues. And that is something that China is also going to still pursue and experiment. And so the focus, so where do we go from now? Now, I want to emphasize that despite the economic challenges that we foresee, it is potentially a cycle, a downturn that will pick up again, as is the case with many boom-bust cycles in market economies. I don't really necessarily see China as repeating Japan's lost decade just because the two countries are in very, very different conditions at this point. I'm only a bit wary about the one parallel, which is during Japan's economic downturn, there was insufficient strong government stimulus to help it ride out that cycle. And they were attributing to some of these the Japanese economic challenges as a structural issue, whereas many experts later on said it was a demand issue, really a deficit in demand. So being more bold in terms of the short run remedies, I think, is also very, very important. But looking forward, China still has a vastly undereducated, underemployed rural population, something like 900 million. So if you look at everywhere around China, there are many cities that have reached above 20,000 per capita income, even 30,000 per capita income. So almost categorized high level, high income places. And there are many very poor ones. So even in terms of within country convergence potential, there is still sizable room to grow. But part of this also relates to the barriers of the hukou system, which prevents migration flows, and a huge amount of internal protectionism that prevents the flow of goods trade among the regions, and many other natural comparative advantage issues that define the disparity of these Chinese regions. But that said, it is one country. And if you look at the US states over time, they have converged. So that means that the poorest states have converged to the richer states over time, or at least that gap has closed. So even by that very basic economic logic, there is still a huge amount of growth potential. Not to mention that convergence between China and the US or advanced Western economies are also there. Whether in terms of productivity, China's TFP, total factor product as a share of the US is only between 20 to 40%. Japan, Taiwan, Singapore, these economies, when they kind of leveled off their growth, their TFP levels as a share of the US TFP levels were already at 70 to 80, 85%. And then if you look at the service sector, I think services is something that will carry China forward. Now, services doesn't make you rich, but as countries become richer, they certainly will demand more services. Currently, it's just about half of GDP, half of China's GDP. They should be reaching 80% share of GDP, as is the case in advanced economies, as well as accounting for only 47% of the employment in China. There are also barriers of entry to services. And this is a sector that has seen a huge amount of growth in productivity in the last few years. And they tend to, compared to manufacturing, absorb more of the high-skilled, highly educated labor force. So this is a sector to focus on in terms of lowering the barriers of entry. Now, if you look at high-tech in the last, I don't recall how many years, but not many years, went from 49,000 high-tech companies to 330,000 high-tech companies, and growth contribution has consistently increased over time. 1.6 trillion RMB contribution to GDP for the green economy, and really seeing a growth rate of 30% to 40% every year. And if we look at the data in the short term, at least compared to 2019, services, travel, entertainment, or even just going out to movies have actually seen higher growth than in 2019. So this suggests that there's an ineluctable march of consumers. What is interesting in the macro figures is that whereas investment really contributed a significant amount of growth as a share of GDP growth in the previous decade, it has steadily declined. I think we should all remember the days in which China's model was deemed to be totally unsustainable because it was investment driven. Well, that investment share of GDP growth has consistently fallen, and the consumption share has risen. Of course, still not a consumption powerhouse, but that rebalancing has happened. Now, let me briefly also talk about some of the important lessons to be drawn from the last decade, but also what we're seeing now. The first, as I have mentioned, is finance is absolutely critical. If China's goal going from now to going forward, and we're seeing in the actions, is to invest heavily and succeed in high-tech areas, high value-added chain, innovation, then finance is really still critical. I think that US being the place where there's the most number of unicorn companies has much to do with how vibrant the financial system, how deep, how liquid, how broad, and the many financial activities in many forms, not just IPO of companies, has been a very important factor. And so there has been some global reallocation of capital. Of course, US FDI in China has fallen, and that, of course, needs to be compensated by other sources of capital. Otherwise, it will affect China's innovation capacity as well to a certain extent. The second is the important lesson is the strength and the challenge of the model. Now, in the New China Playbook, in my book, I did talk about how very unique this model, this political centralization, economic decentralization, in common terms, in layman's terms, let's call it the mayor economy, has been very important in expediting China's tremendous growth, because the mayors it's really the provincial governors, the provincial party secretaries, the mayors, and all that local officials were very entrepreneurial in jumpstarting ecosystems, jumpstarting industries, and very quickly going into new sectors and creating something from scratch. Now, that really worked given China's institutional constraints at that time, which is, it was still not a mature economy. Markets were not fully mature. The financial system, obviously, businesses, licenses, land, all of these resources, permits were all in the hands of the local government, so they could do a lot. Now, I just want to bring two case studies, which is very relevant today, to showcase how that decentralized model could be potentially very powerful, but then we'll just mention the problems with that model as well. Now, if you look at solar and EVs as two case studies, we all know that China basically led the global boom in solar since the mid-2000s, or at least the late 2000s. Between 2005 and 2020, solar costs dropped by something like 95%. And between 2004 and 2013, Chinese solar firms increased production by 76% annually. The revenues of solar companies were spread over thousands of firms all over China, not just focused in a few key cities. Now, what's also important is that China's solar innovation has also been very successful. Patents increases, many cities having yearly new patents in the range of thousands from nothing. If you look at a map of 2005 of solar production, solar innovation in China, it's a desert. 10 years later, it's totally blossomed into many cities, over 40, 50 cities having major accomplishments in solar production and innovation. And China since has moved to the technological frontier with US and Germany in this sector. Now, what people perhaps have not understood is that whilst this was a centralized decision strategically, everything was implemented locally. And so at different periods of time in different geographies, local governments implemented industrial policies. That could be subsidies, but it's not purely financial subsidies. There are many things that go with it, including infrastructure, EV charging stations, including land, including helping them attract talent, including helping them build supply chains or coordinate supply chains. So there's something that's totally missing in our models of economic models, the canonical models, which is the role of the state in coordination and mobilization. We kind of swept that under the rug because we believe the state should not play such a dominant role. But in the case of the solar, in the case of EVs, the decentralized mechanism really did work. If you just purely look at the accomplishment, and turning to EVs, something similar. The EV pilot policies were first started in 13 cities, and then it was rolled out to 80 cities. And again, if you look at this map between when it first started to 10 years later, within 10 years, EV production, but also EV patents, EV-related patents innovation has skyrocketed. Within 10 years, China became the leader and accounted for 67% of the global market share in 2023. And production went from 1,400 vehicles in 2009 to 9.6 million in 2023. And EV-related applications between 2011 and 2018 grew 31 times. It's very, very difficult to say, the state model doesn't work, right? If you just look at the kind of results that it has had. And obviously, it was not purely based on private market alone. Just look at, the challenges that we have in climate mitigation technologies. Now, okay, having talked a little bit about the successes, and I think we should acknowledge that they are, there are also downsides. And this is the constant tension, that China has to deal with. And when we evaluate China's model, that we also have to be very, very aware of. One such thing is potentially too much production, right? Do we really need 80 cities all working on their own EV companies when we know that when push comes to shove, when the market mechanisms start to play a greater role, then there will probably be a handful of EV companies that would have survived. And the other is, of course, there's substantial waste, substantial inefficiencies, and local protectionism is another major downside of the model. Every government wanted their own local champion, so they would not be able to be open to other car companies coming into their region. Now, that means that scale, it's hard to achieve scale. Part of the great benefits about China is the massive scale and massive learning very quickly. Now, that has mitigated or curbed a certain degree of that scale and learning effects by virtue of these local protectionism. And of course, the recent problems with the debt, which is a local government debt issue. Now, the local governments have had their economic objectives, the responsibilities, and they have local tournaments between provinces, between cities, and they all want to outcompete each other. And one very, common way to do it is to outspend or outborrow. Let's be very clear-eyed about the problems of these models. It's very difficult to estimate the cost of this. It's very difficult to estimate the benefits of these new sectors, especially China's successes. So on net, I'm still of the view that at least given that particular period of time and of development, stage in development and institutional constraints, that was on the whole a model that totally accelerated China's development. China, in all modern human history, has been the fastest growing country for the longest period of time. And I don't think we should all attribute it just to markets, because lots of other developing countries have free markets without the type of success. But it is important, and this is the last lesson to face, which is going forward, it no longer can rely just on that kind of political economy model. Why? Because China's economy is ready for the market mechanisms to play the most important role. I mean, it does, but to play the majority of the role, I should add. We see that, when the subsidies have subsided, for EVs or solar panels, market competition drives out the weakest links. And by the way, competition is one of the most intense aspects of the Chinese economy. This is also one of the reasons why, by and large, many industrial policies are actually successful in China, because ultimately they led to more competition, not more monopolies by the state, but more competition. So there's been a huge amount of studies on industrial policies recently, and I think we need to have a very nuanced view about these things. So without going into too much detail about the China model and the new era, let me just say in the last 2 minutes, the greater geopolitical landscape. Geoeconomics, geopolitics is featuring very prominently. Now, since the US-China trade wars, we're finally seeing some of the consequences of that, the start of that trend. However, even though US and China direct trade linkages might have fallen, reduced, investments have reduced, they're simply going through third countries, in particular countries like Mexico and Vietnam. And there has been, some recent studies. There's still, very preliminary studies, but it's very clear that if you look at a graph, countries to which China exports more, the U.S. also imports more from. So, for instance, Vietnam and Mexico have become major export destinations for China. At the same time, U.S. imports more from them. And if you look at Mexico's trade share of GDP, it went from 77% in 2019 all the way to 90% in 2023. Vietnam increased by 20 percentage points. And you see also Chinese investments in Vietnam and Mexico also skyrocketing. Chinese FDI was the fastest growing of all other nations, 21% increase in the last couple of years. And so there's a clear indication that it's not deglobalization, but it's a reorganization of globalization. Now, of course, this gives some third countries more of an opportunity, which is good for them, although we have to see whether this is more of a temporary phenomenon or a more permanent phenomenon. But this also does increase trade costs because, in the end, let's not kid ourselves, the US and China are still the largest and second largest economy in the world, the ultimate source of supply and demand in the world. They are inextricably linked. Even if it's not directly as much as it was before at the peak, they are indirectly linked, only one country apart. And as we know, global supply chains are a network. They're simply not just a bilateral kind of relationship. And how do I want to end this? Look, I want to say that there are a lot of global changes on top of domestic challenges for the Chinese economy. The Chinese economy is still very resilient, not least because the Chinese people themselves are. Now, they respond to structural changes such as jobs moving away from them to Vietnam, to other countries, not as, oh, look, the Vietnamese are stealing our jobs. No, we never hear about that in the newspaper in the way that we hear about the Chinese stealing jobs from the US. No, they responded more positively. What's the next sector? How do we move into other sectors? Chinese companies are thinking about going global. Now, of course, there are also other challenges there, but as we mentioned, Asia is a natural place that they can deploy their latest technologies and present that kind of market size. So the resilience of the people are are manifested in ways in which they're seeking for new opportunities while they ride out that cycle. So I'd say that, let's give it some time. We should be patient. China is still very much open to business around the world. Everything is part of the global supply chain. Even if China leads in solar and EVs, they are still all a global supply chain, with China recently investing heavily in Hungary, Spain, and many European countries to set up their EV joint ventures and platforms. The table has turned around. It's actually using Chinese technologies for European markets rather than the other way around. But China's spirit undoubtedly is, domestic challenges, but definitely keep the opportunities open for the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jin. Fantastic, real tour de force in 30 minutes of so much that even someone like me who thinks I know a bit about China, I learned a great deal. We have questions streaming in. I only have 5 minutes for this section, but I know you've been kind enough to suggest you will join us when the panel discussion starts. and we put some questions to you. But here's a couple of questions that I just thought if you could take 1 minute to answer. The first one, is China still a developing country? You mentioned the 900 million people, and therefore what does that mean in terms of one end, modernizing and essentially keeping the growth trajectory? Is there the risk of people being left behind? Big question, but I'm going to ask you to try and respond very quickly, and then we can get into the discussions later. The second question is, it seems like China's recent policy has been to limit outward bound investment funds, even to BRI partners. Is this being done to increase their internal monetary velocity? And if so, is China risking further decoupling from trade partners? So big questions, but if you could respond very quickly. To the others who are sending in questions, please keep them coming. We will deal with them during the panel discussion. Over to you, Dr. Tjhin.
Yes, very quickly. By many measures, China is a developing country. If you look at per capita income, especially if you look at the poor regions, if you look at things like financial system, I totally argue that it's still a developing country. Not yet mature system, rule of law, corporate governance issues. If you look at, again, the financial sector as a whole, what we really need in China is many rating agencies, many credit, financial institutions to properly govern the entire financial and capital markets, and that still is missing. To give you one important example, but if you look at China's innovative capacity, its dominance in leading edge technology sectors, its huge strive and competitiveness in emerging strategic sectors, general purpose AI technologies, it is certainly a very advanced economies. I just say finally that it is a very interesting question. How many big countries have become rich? Not many. I think there's only one, which is the United States in the top 10. So could China's other cities, other places, rural-urban divide gap close so that they eventually converge? The many rich cities in China is a very open question, but still that presents as, I think, an opportunity. Outward FDI, I've also been asking the same question. I think partly it is has something to do with China's fiscal constraints domestically, but more importantly, as I have been speaking with some people, they believe that the geopolitical challenges abroad have also risen, which is why they're pulling back. And many of these investments used to go to Europe and the US, of course. Now, of course, that is dramatically more difficult. There's still many more FDI funds, deployed in the Belt and Road and developing countries. But I think that they are seeing a lot more kind of external shocks, and not just geopolitical, but external economy. The global economy has also not been spectacularly doing very well. So I think these are the main issues.
Thank you, Dr. Tjhin. There's more questions coming in. I have to move on. There's one that I ask you to think about, and we'll get you back on the panel. Can China grow rich before it grows old? My question is, does it need to be rich? But that's something we can discuss. And what is rich defined in the context of the large nation that China is?